Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. This is your host Sri Iyer. Please do click on the subscribe button. We thank you for your support. I have with me today Pandit Satish Sharma from Virat Hindustan Sangam, United Kingdom. Satish ji, welcome to PGurus channel.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ayerji, as always. A wonderful opportunity to explore a very, very strange set of circumstances that have arisen over here. So thank you for the chance to speak to you.
Thank you. So viewers, I want to take you back to sometime in 1947 when a Britisher who had never lived in India set sail, arrives in India and is tasked with drawing the partitioning of India and Pakistan. The line went through some houses. Some people had to cross a country to use their bathroom. Some people were not even that lucky. They had to cook their food in another country. Now, after this line was drawn, and by the way, there were a lot of things that happened. For instance, people tell me that on 15th of August, it was not clear if Lahore was going to be part of India or Pakistan. So there was that also. But the reason I'm mentioning all this is because when this partitioning happened, it set off an exodus on both sides of the countries. Many Hindus who were fleeing Pakistan ended up in what is today the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now 72 years, and those who were unfortunate enough to land up in this landmass, they never got voting rights, nor did they get positions in the government. They just couldn't apply for them. More or less, these people have been living as second class or even third class citizens in the free country of India. So when the Namo government, Prime Minister Modi's government came and did this historical move of abolishing Article 370, they finally restored parity to this long-suffering milieu of people. Now, I don't know what these list of 45 members of Parliament of Britain were thinking when they signed this letter protesting the action of the Indian government to the United Nations. The interesting thing is it is signed on the House of Commons letterhead. To get a little bit more perspective of who these 45 MPs are, let's join Satish ji. Satish ji, what is your take on this?
Okay, it's quite an intricate situation. And you started by mentioning Cyril Radcliffe and the line that he drew. I think many people should realize that not only was it an act of mischief in drawing that line, but there were some little quirks in that line. For example, the birthplace of Guru Nanak ji was kept in Pakistan, tantalizingly visible from across the new line from Punjab. Now, what sort of a person would do that? And so it's riddled with all sorts of anomalies right the way across. The spectacle of British parliamentarians suddenly becoming all very moralistic and now starting to object to the United Nations directly is an extraordinary set of circumstances. It's almost as though a bunch of sixth formers who have done a little bit of parliamentary role play have been allowed to run amok. If you have a look at the actual signatories, I think of the 45, 43 of them are all from one party, the Labour Party. So conventional democratic process and parliamentary process would really encourage MPs to form a consensus, submit it to the various policy divisions within the party. The party would think about it and it would issue it as a manifesto. The public would vote on it, and then eventually it may or may not become party policy and it may or not become government policy. So that's the way in which serious, seasoned policymakers and litigators would work. But what we have is a bunch of 43 Labour MPs, and for some reason there are a couple of Scottish nationalists who've crept in there as well. It may have been late on a Friday afternoon or something. But the 43 are all Labour parliamentarians, and they have bypassed all of that process and chosen to write directly to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And as you mentioned, it's on the House of Commons letterhead. It's not on the Labour Party letterhead. So it seems to give the impression that it has the gravitas associated with a communication from the House of Commons when clearly it doesn't. Now, the United Nations has been very clear. It's just dispensed with any allegations that Pakistan have made, representations they've made, saying, no, it's entirely legal. What has happened is not a surprise. It has followed due legal process, and there is no evidence of any atrocities. But what there's a wonderfully powerful global propaganda exercise where, as I say, sixth formers seem to be running around making lots and lots of noise because they haven't got the legitimacy to be able to challenge the status quo as it's arisen. We've got talks now of protests being made by Pakistani communities up and down the country and across the world. But frankly, it's not contributing towards the harmony of the countries in which these communities are settled. We've got in the UK a mix of all sorts of denominations and communities. And for us, one particular community represented by one particular political party to import potential conflicts from the other part of the world and then to replay them on the streets of England and London is not a wise move. One would have hoped that wiser heads would have prevailed and suggested, well, actually, what's happening over there, let's leave it over there. It doesn't impact upon the well-being of the homeless in London. It doesn't help the issues of Brexit to be resolved any sooner. So it seems to be as though a small group of people without seasoned political wisdom have just taken it upon themselves to do and to engage in really what really belong in sixth form common rooms as opposed to in the debating chamber of the House of Commons.
From what I know of, the group of people who constitute Sanatanis, in my opinion, like Sikhs, Jains, and Hindus, they form about 3% of the Great Britain population. I'm including all the 4 territories, and they probably contribute about 6% of the GDP. Is that a correct number, Satishji?
That's correct. It's a number which is regularly rolled out by parliamentarians when they're wanting to curry the Hindu vote, if you don't mind me using a pun. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. They always push this out there and say, 2% of the population, 6% of GDP, etc., etc. Surprisingly, and noticeable by its absence, there is never a statistic trotted out for the other black and ethnic minority communities. It's always the Hindus. Maybe we're susceptible to this, but it would be interesting to know how much of GDP the contribution is actually as a result of the economic activities of the other minorities. That's a wonderful point. I think I'll inquire further and see whether we can establish that for our next conversation.
Right. Thank you, sir. And I think the numbers that I have looked up on the web seems to indicate that the other minority is around 8% of the UK population. So you're talking about roughly 4 times the size. Is that correct?
That's probably about right. And there are now suggestions that perhaps that's on the lower side, the estimate. It may be a little bit higher than that as well.
I see. So in Britain, when somebody arrives at the shores of Britain, I know they get health benefits for free. Do they also get voting rights?
That's a good question. I think their status here determines whether they do or they don't. There are very, very complicated provisions in terms of how a person acquires asylum and the various categories of asylum identifier that are available. So I'm not too sure about that, but I'd be surprised if a random stranger automatically acquires the capacity to vote. It may be the case.
I see. And what is the average time for getting, say, I think you have 2 stages, right? You have a permanent residency and then you have citizenship, correct?
That's right. But again, the UK has been going through a turbulent time. You may have heard of the Windrush difficulties that beleaguered Prime Minister May's last few months, where people who'd been here for 40, 50 years were suddenly deemed to be no longer eligible for permanent residency status. So very, very odd. But it is part of the scenario that we're facing, in that decisions seem to be being made on a very ad hoc, knee-jerk basis in many, many areas. And there really is a requirement for good, strong leadership from the political leadership groups. The Labour Party desperately need to have a review at their leadership practices and the manner in which they're corralling and developing consensus with the party, because it seems to be all over the place at the moment.
Satish, I have a slightly off-topic question, but still relevant. At any given day, there are about 20,000 people waiting to cross over from Calais to Dover. I may be pronouncing these two words horribly. Pardon me for that. But you get the sense of the thing. Now, what is it that these people expect from UK that they are not getting in France?
It's maybe it's a casualty of being very successful in your marketing. Okay, so we have a former colonial power which trumpeted its greatness, and the streets of London are paved with gold, and that whole marketing message reverberated around the globe for the best part of 3 generations. And so it's there as the magical Shangri-La that a lot of people aspire to get to. Sadly, for many people, when they do get here, the reality is slightly different. But the message is still out there, and it will take a long time for it to disappear. There are many cases of people who, once they've arrived here and have struggled with the changing social benefits scenario, and then felt that they were better off. Even we've had Syrian refugees who have decided they were better off back in Syria. So yeah, it's a changing climate, very volatile.
So I grew up listening to BBC. In fact, the confirmation that Mrs. Indira Gandhi was no more was ascertained by listening to the BBC. BBC was already talking about who's going to succeed, while the Air India, All India Radio, was still saying that she's been hospitalized and not really telling on the truth. So in terms of from that point to now, there appears to have been a fair amount of transformation that has taken place with the BBC's approach towards India, isn't it? I mean, now suddenly BBC is all critical. What do you make of that? Why do you think this is happening?
I think it's a great concept to consider. If you have a think for a moment, the BBC is a mammoth corporation. It's huge. It has so many employees in the tens of thousands. It's a very big operator, and they've been in the communications business for a long period of time. So their attention to detail and their attention to the use of language is very refined and very honed. One thing we've noticed is how they use this language to set a slightly different narrative. For example, they always speak of India occupied Kashmir. Okay. Now, according to the law, that is an intrinsic part of the nation. Just to try and give you an example, how strange it would seem if we referred to Britain occupied Ireland for Northern Ireland, or perhaps Britain occupied Gibraltar, or Britain occupied Falklands, which is a long way away, much further from Britain than Kashmir is from India. So it's noticeable that they use language in a manner which is quite unfortunate, and it's far too common, it's far too frequent, it's far too consistent for it to be anything other than an established desire to communicate a particular narrative. And that's entirely unacceptable. And I think increasingly people are beginning to notice this.
And now let's address the most curious thing that has been happening. The British Broadcasting Corporation put out a video of unrest in Kashmir. If you look at the video, you see BBC exclusive. And amazingly, the same thing was also showing up in Al Jazeera channels. So okay. First off, the thing is, how can something be exclusive if two channels are sharing it? And I don't know which one came first and which one came later. The second thing is, the video is palpably wrong. People have really poked holes at it. It seems to have been shot from 4 different angles using cameras. I mean, if you look at something that is spontaneous, you will see that jerky movement of people trying to position themselves, getting jostled about. These are the telltale signs of somebody capturing something going on. That person who's capturing it is also nervous, doesn't want to catch a stray bullet or a stray lathi. And so all that is missing is a very professionally shot picture. And BBC seems to have thought that this was what was happening in Kashmir. Now, this is not the first instance where BBC has been caught peddling fake news or fake narratives. Now, why do you think BBC is doing this? And in your opinion, what is it that is driving BBC? After all, it is being funded by the state of the government of United Kingdom, isn't it?
Well, let's remember that the BBC is a state broadcaster. It's not a private entity, and it is funded from the public purse, as you say. So we have an entity which the majority of the Hindu community now in the UK accept has its own message and its own orientation. And the tragedy is that it's continuously, serially being found to have been presenting a negative spin, slant, bias on anything to do with Modi ji, certainly, and increasingly with the Hindu community. We have the vanilla broadcasts, which are about, here's a little bit about Diwali at a temple in the West Midlands, and how isn't it wonderful? But when it comes to a contentious or a disputed issue, or one where there is a conflict, it's immediately noticeable, it's transparent that there is an orientation and a bias that's present there. Amongst the community, it's almost referred to now as broadcasting British colonialism. This is what BBC stands for. They still have that mindset that out there is a world, and if you can project a British voice into that world, we can change it and make people in our own image. That's still very, very present. It's a tragedy that the majority of the people who seem to be having the editorial choice, they seem to have very little understanding of what's really happening, the pulse of the world and the ebb and flow of people and ideas. It's almost as though it's left the BBC in its Victorian times. We have objected so many times to the BBC about their bias, and the majority of responses tend to be the boilerplate response where it's gone into somebody's computer system, they've just cut and pasted the standard response and out it goes. It is horrifically difficult to engage with the editorial policy makers at the BBC. But the Hindu community and I think the broader British community are also beginning to feel that the BBC is actually it's almost running amok with its own intentions and its own agenda. Recently, in fact, only yesterday, somebody launched a petition questioning the BBC's lack of balance in that particular program that you referred to, and other programs and news reporting to do with Section 370. And just in 24 hours, I think it's almost 8,500 signatures. So it's really ramping up. And I think the BBC should really take notice that its position in the world is not one of colonialist supremacy that it used to have.
Absolutely, and you have to call it both ways. Either BBC says it as it sees it, or shut shop. Come on now. The credibility that it used to have. In fact, I remember, I don't know if it was Yes Prime Minister episode or what, wherein an African dictator is actually listening to BBC to really confirm whether there's a coup happening in his country or not. That is the kind of credibility, gravitas, that the BBC had.
I think they're suffering now from almost a psychological term. You could call it post-colonial identity crisis, shall we say. They're struggling to rework how to fit into this new world where really projecting a colonialist ideology or an orientation just doesn't work anymore. It is unacceptable.
And I think while we are at it, maybe they should look at what 10,000 people were doing, giving fake news, and that too not even produced by them, produced by somebody else, and pawned off to them. And then they're trying to make it, they're trying to pass it off as BBC exclusive, which is really, really unfortunate.
I think that if the BJP government were to instruct the BBC to either become more balanced, or the permission and rights to broadcast into India would be reviewed, I think perhaps the BBC would listen. And I'm fairly confident it will take something along those lines to get it to sit back and think, oh my goodness, we misjudged this. Because the momentum with which they're broadcasting India-centric, Hindu-centric, Modi-centric, BJP-centric news is clearly biased.
Well, these are certainly sobering thoughts, and I'm hoping and praying that the government of India does act in this direction. Although I have been disappointed with their inaction against some other channels, which shall not go mentioned here. You know who I'm talking about, because you had helped me release the book in England, in London, at Jawaharlal Nehru Club, no less. And this, now by now, all the viewers know the cat is out of the bag. But Satish ji, thank you very much for joining this hangout, and we'll be back with more on the happenings in Britain and how this plays out, because it is still a few more days before the independence of India celebrations start. So let's see how this thing plays out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time, Ajay, and best of luck, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.